Okay. So can you see the screen? My screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for agreeing to be part of this discussion for the Digital Future World event. It is a great honor for me to have the chance to converse with you. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you at last.
Thank you. Concerning our talk today, I decided to divide the conversation into three main parts. First of all, a general discussion concerning the encounters between different cultures and disciplines and how these encounters affect ideas and understanding. Secondly, a slightly more technical conversation regarding some of my work and design techniques and how these, in my opinion, relate to your work. And finally, a chance to focus on the critical events of 2020 and how these are changing world and society. All three sections, explicitly or not, concern combinatory and intersectional states that are eventually hybrids. So, but first of all, let me briefly introduce Graham Harman and myself to the audience. Graham Harman is a distinguished professor of philosophy at SCI-Arc in Los Angeles. His most recent book is Art and Object, that I have there. He's a founding member of the speculative realism and object-oriented ontology movements. He's editor-in-chief of Open Philosophy, whose work has been translated in 24 languages. I'm an Italian architect and professor, principal and founder at Niccolo Casas Architecture, a visiting faculty member at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and a PhD candidate at Bartlett, UCL in London. I run a multidisciplinary practice for research and architecture that aims to combine several fields of specialization so as to offer an innovative and unique vision of the academic discipline and profession. So in this first section, I'd like to talk with you about space, communication, and encounters. In particular, the situations in which these encounters are not direct and perhaps conflicting or contradictory. So I want to start by showing you this image. It was taken by photographers Warren Duprez and Nick Thornton-Jones for the magazine Immortal. It captures a dress, a 3D printed one, the Magma dress, that I co-created with Dutch fashion designer Iris van Herpen. In a way, this shot beautifully synthesized my work. Indeed, it combines design, the pattern, the body, the dress, and the space into a unique piece. What is interesting to me is that in this image, the different elements do not gently merge. Instead, they are united by overlap. They coexist whilst preserving their individuality. My work is evidently constructed on multidisciplinarity with fashion, fashion tech, narrative, automotive, and so on. And multidisciplinarity is a form of confrontation. In my experience of all kinds of confrontations, the ones that are most interesting are those in which different perspectives are somehow preserved. My belief is that in multidisciplinary collaboration, the viewpoints should remain somehow separated. This in order to offer the best precondition for something that does not belong to confronted to emerge. From this interest in interactions that are not mediated, derived my idea of hypersection, to which I refer later on. So this is my first question for you. As a philosopher working with architects and artists confronting different domains and areas, how have these encounters impacted your thinking?
Quite a lot. And the simplest way is simply that architecture is a fairly prolific discipline, quite apart from the designs. The architectural theory is quite prolific, going back to the Renaissance. And so there's been this whole corpus of texts I've had to try to slowly master, and people who work in different styles from how I work. And so I've had the chance in middle age to become a student again, and I really appreciate that. You need that kind of mental exercise to stay young and fresh. And you feel resistance from these new kinds of texts that you aren't familiar with. And there are different sorts of problems. And there are already existing debates and interchanges between philosophers and architects, and yet they don't cover everything that could be said. And so the great thing for me has simply been having access to the SCI-Arc library. In fact, my office is inside the SCI-Arc library. A wealth of new things to learn there.
That's fantastic. And so I'd like to go back for a moment to your time in Providence, talking about libraries. As you know, I'm a visiting faculty member at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. I believe Providence to be a special city full of disparities. The ancient district of College Hill contrasts physically, socially, and economically with downtown. On one side, the hill, on the other, the plain, the Victorian and American colonial houses, and the 20th century and contemporary tall buildings, the prestigious school and the business office, but also the rich people and the homeless. I've always found it intriguing that the Brown University, that is in the Ivy League, is on the top of the hill, while RISD, the School of Art, faces the Providence River, just on the edge between Hill and downtown. Moreover, Providence has been home to some of my favorite artists, Shepard Fairey, Francesca Woodman, Edgar Allan Poe, and of course, H.P. Lovecraft. They all strongly relate, albeit in different ways, to architecture. So I was wondering which feelings emerge when you think of your time there and of the space you had around you. And you are now a fundamental reference for contemporary architecture. Do you think architecture and Providence in particular, with its contrast, was relevant to the formulation of your early thinking?
Architecture was not something I was drawn to as a young person. It had to grow on me. And it's not an area in which I had strong individual tastes. I've had to develop those tastes, and I'm still in the process of development. But I'll get back to Providence and architecture in a second. I want to say that I did spend most of the summer of 2011 in Providence working on Weird Realism, my Lovecraft book. And that helped in a couple of ways. One is that I did go look at the manuscripts in the library. They won't let you look at the originals because they're too fragile now, but they have photocopies. And you can learn quite a bit about Lovecraft as a writer from seeing the manuscripts. He wrote them. He wrote the stories on church stationery or insurance company stationery, and he crossed out a lot of words. And I found that his editing, his self-editing, was almost always right. Whenever he crossed out a word and wrote a new one in, it was almost always an improvement. So you can see he's a very informal, but also a thorough and careful writer. Also, the atmosphere of Providence is just a little strange, as I think you've pointed out. There's something a bit eerie about it. I happened to be staying the whole time in a bed and breakfast on, I don't know what the street's called, College Street, maybe. It's a street where the house that features in his short story, The Shunned House, is there. There's a French sign on the outside that says, "Attention, chien bizarre." They're making a joke about the story. And then a little further down that same street is where Edgar Allan Poe courted Mrs. Whitman, if that was her name, fairly late in life, and she's buried in a graveyard, an old graveyard down that street. It's anyway. You're sort of halfway down the hill there. You're on the same level as RISD,
exactly.
And then to go up to Brown, it's one of the most exhausting cities. The hills are so steep. Walking from RISD to Brown, your heart rate goes way up. And then back to architecture. If those who have read The Call of Cthulhu, there are a couple of architectural remarks in there. One is he talks about how the finest Georgian steeple in America, it's beautiful, that white church, whatever it's called, from the Georgian period of King George, is ruined by, what does he call the sculptor's house across the street? It's like a hideous Norman imitation of such and such architecture. I've forgotten how he describes it, but it's one of the most detailed architectural descriptions in his stories. And Lovecraft was a kind of connoisseur of Georgian architecture and would take punishing tours on foot of old American cities to see the Georgian architecture. So for him, it was definitely an issue. And then, of course, at the Mountains of Madness, the description of the city in the Antarctic, one of the greatest architectural descriptions ever written, even though it's not about a real city, I think is one of his finest moments as a writer.
Yeah, I think I have some new readings before going back to Providence now. So yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, actually, you're talking a lot about architecture, and that's fantastic. So earlier I mentioned the term hypersection. As I briefly implied, the concept concern those interactions that are not mediated. in the sense that the items that interplay do so indirectly by remaining distinct. It is an idea that concerns all: communication, space, and design. In terms of design, it evidently relates to the geometric intersection. Imagine two lines crossing, their shared point, the intersection, is at the same time the element of union and separation. It is a coexistence of oppositional condition. The two lines relate without the need for them to bend or adapt to one another. This is what I call non-mediation. I believe this condition to be powerful enough to generate entire newness in the emergent sense of the term, something more than its participants. Think about my collaboration with the fashion designer Iris van Herpen. Are they dresses? Not really. Are they architecture? Not, surely not. I think it is not by chance that Iris calls those art applied to the body. On this point, I think it is interesting that she often displays her dresses as they are, without a person wearing them, surrounded by a dark background as if they were isolated objects. At the same time, I believe a point of connection to be necessary in non-direct relations, albeit a non-evident one. On this matter, I think it is intriguing that the Italian term abito means both, at the same time, dress and I in a habit. Their common etymology lies in the Latin word habere, that is to have, but also what is habitual. In this, the ancients saw a common trait between architecture and fashion, but also between possession and recognition. So I think this in some way relates to your opposite theme of strangeness. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I have a couple of things to say about this topic. The first one is I think we're using mediation in opposite senses, because for me, when something is indirect, that's when I use the term mediated, whereas you're using mediated to mean direct. But what we agree about is that the indirect connection is better than the direct kind. The first thing I thought about when I was reading your thoughts on sections is the novel Flatland from the 19th century about the two-dimensional worlds where they're unable to see three-dimensional solids except for one section at a time. And that's sometimes used by analogy to try to explain to us what it would look like if a four-dimensional object passed through our three-dimensional universe. We would be seeing different shapes of it at different times as it passed through. Here's the thing, though. When you combine these two different forms into one, you have to look to make sure the combination works, right? Because the mere fact of combining two things doesn't guarantee a result.
No,
and I have a couple of thoughts about that. One of them is I've noticed architecture students in particular have a hard time justifying their forms without discussing the process that gave rise to the form. They seem to think that's enough, that they say, oh, I took this and I combined it with this, and here's what I got. Isn't it cool? And yeah, sometimes those are interesting processes, but in a way, when you create a form, the process isn't going to be there to justify the form. So you have to create something that stands on its own. One other thought comes to mind. The literary critic Harold Bloom, who died recently, who talks a lot about the anxiety of influence and how every creative person is wrestling with past creative people and trying to break away from them and find their own original voice. One of the ways he thinks people do that is by combining two previous influences. So, for example, he says that the three great American novelists of the early 20th century, meaning Hemingway, Faulkner, and Fitzgerald, he says all found their style by combining Conrad with a different influence. For one of them, it was Henry James. For one, it was Mark Twain. And for the other, it was, I'm forgetting at the moment. And they're combining two past influences and making a new style out of it. And it occurred to me that, yes, that's a good reading of those novelists, but it could also be done by a failed novelist. Somebody could try to combine two past novelists, and it just wouldn't pan out. So there has to be a quality check at the end. So what are you looking for when you combine these two things in a section? Do you throw any of them out? You decide that some of them don't work?
It is not easy. Actually, the thing that you look at when you combine something is it depends on your target. In my collaboration, generally when I do collaboration, my target is to escape fields. So to generate something that is not architecture, not fashion, or in case of other collaboration, not automotive, not narrative, not fashion tech, not fashion, so fashion tech. The idea is to combine two items to generate something that is, again, in the emergent sense of the word, something that is other, or in another place, in another space.
Right.
So, yeah, while I was formulating the idea of hypersection, I had the chance to read your analysis of metaphor in Object-Oriented Ontology, a New Theory of Everything. Your reading and expansion of Jose Ortega's analysis of metaphor was for me illuminating. In fact, the relation between intersection and hypersection adopts the structure of metaphor. Intersection is the precondition for a hypersection to emerge, as the metaphor is for a real object to be generated. What was crucial to me was your insistence on the tension between the combined elements, on the fact that the metaphor as a real object happens elsewhere, indirectly. So object-oriented ontology has been very often interpreted as a philosophy of separation. But in my opinion, just my opinion, this is a superficial reading. It's a bold statement, but I would assert that object-oriented ontology is also the philosophy of union, albeit an indirect union, and an artistic one. Would you agree with that interpretation?
Yes, I would. The standard person on the streets knowledge of object-oriented ontology is that it's about withdrawal, right? It's about things hiding and not being knowable. And that's certainly a big part of it, but you can get that from Kant and Heidegger. You don't need O for that. That's not what characterizes O. What characterizes O, object-oriented ontology, is this notion of a loose relation between objects and their qualities. The fact that objects have an ambiguous relation with their own qualities. They both have them and don't have them. Qualities are part essential and part accidental. Things can change their qualities within certain limits and still be the same thing. This is how change happens in the world. And so yes, in that sense there's separation, but there's also connection, as you say. There's the connection of strange things that don't belong together. Because the real enemy of O is literalism. This idea that a thing is exhausted if you simply figure out what qualities it has. Whereas our idea is that, no, that will only get you part of the way, right? The thing itself is always something more than its qualities. And one of the ways you create interesting effects is by combining things that it is impossible to literalize. And metaphor is an example of that. When you say the wine dark sea, the sea doesn't literally have the same color as the wine, right? There's a bit of difference to it. But by ascribing a literal identity between the wine and the sea, you get a forced relation between two things that don't quite go together. But they have to sort of go together. You can't just try to combine two things metaphorically that have no relation at all. It might work as an intellectual experiment, but it doesn't have a metaphorical effect on the reader. And the example given by Andrei Varminsky back in the 80s was drinking a milkshake is like drawing an isosceles triangle. And it's cute in a sort of Dadaist way, but it doesn't really have a metaphorical effect on the reader. It's a kind of Dadaist literalism. It's a kind of middle finger to literalism. It doesn't create a new identity. Whereas things that hit in the middle are what work. And any effective metaphor we can think of probably works that way.
Yeah, I think it is why, in general, I'm interested in those kind of collaboration in terms of communication, but also in what I call, again, an indirect relation, but in your case, it's only relation because they're all indirect. It's a possibility to combine or two different thinking or two different patterns, so to make basically create an impossible combination between those, and so to generate something else. So yes, as I was saying, hypersection resonates on coexistence, thereby opening up to interpretation, misinterpretation, or even lying. So I'd like to ask you for your opinion on architecture and communication. It seems that you have, as you have done now, always insisted that the literal description of object is a form of undermining. You are also very knowledgeable about the work of and the writings of Patrick Schumacher, with whom you had some very interesting confrontations. I'm aware that you two fundamentally disagree, but also that you hold the other in high esteem. As I'm sure you understand, I believe disagreement to be more productive than agreement. So when Patrick Schumacher talks about architecture as a system of communication, following the ideas of Niklas Luhmann, my impression is that most of the time he refers to communication as information, or better as instruction. Hypersection in terms of communication refers to narrative. In this, I have been collaborating and discussing with narrative and artificial expert Dr. Beth Cartier. So hypersection focus on elements that have a double significance, that point of connection. For me, it is like the difference between a book and a guide. I believe architecture in certain situations should also surprise, confound, and perhaps even irritate. So what is, in short, of course, your opinion on architecture and communication?
Yeah, I would start by saying I have enjoyed my conversations with Patrick Schumacher. He's given to controversial public statements, but I have a lot of time for the guy. He's always up for a debate, and he takes it as well as he dishes it out, which is rare. He'll be very firm in rejecting anything you say, but you can also do the same to him in return. And so there's a certain basic honesty to exchanges with that man that I love. That said, I don't see how he can possibly interpret architecture as being all about communication, because obviously it's at least in part not about communication. You're creating enclosed spaces. You're creating spaces that differ from the spaces around and outside them. You're creating, even if he denies it, you're creating rooms, right? You're creating spaces within a structure that don't communicate easily with each other. You're trying to modulate the natural sunlight many times, or atmospheric noise. And so it's at least as much about non-communication as about communication. That's the first thing. The second thing is he doesn't quite get Luhmann right. Yes, Luhmann's about communication, but again, Luhmann is about non-communication more than anything. Autopoiesis and social systems are about how certain systems are locked into themselves and replicate themselves. They don't communicate with the outside, with the environments. The environment is somehow opaque to them. They have to translate the environment into their own terms before they can process it. So I disagree both on the architecture side and on the side of his interpretation of Luhmann. Also, when it comes to relationality, sometimes people, as you hinted, sometimes people think OOO is only about non-relationality, but again, that's a half-truth. The idea is that the number of relations are limited, right? It's not that nothing relates. That's the old formalism. The old formalism is nothing relates to anything else. OOO is more about the fact that a thing admits certain external influences into its heart and excludes others. So even if you think you're doing a piece of architecture that is the most site-specific architecture ever, you're really only looking at 5 or 6 aspects of the site, maybe 8. There are lots of aspects of the site that you are trying to exclude deliberately, or that you never think about. And so it's always a very selective thing. And this is why I think a certain degree of formalism is unavoidable in all human arts, architecture, and any human activity. You're always very selective. So this idea that everything is blended into this holistic zeitgeist, it's ultimately a Hegelian idea, that architecture expresses the spirit of the age. No. A lot of times architecture, like any other activity, runs counter to the spirit of the age. Which of the architects today is the best expression of our current time? Well, you can't really find one unless you distort the meaning of their architecture. There are lots of different architects and architectural styles at any given time, just like there are many different philosophies at any given time. And it's hard to correlate one of them with the spirit of the age. In fact, the better somebody is at their job, the more likely they are to resist the excesses of their age. So I'm quite opposed to this idea that everything is interconnected and everything that happens simultaneously is an expression of the same underlying idea.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also, communication, then it's a matter of interpretation of even if it was about communication, there is also the personal interpretation, understanding, and reaction to communication. Mm-hmm. But yeah, anyway, let's go to the section 2 of this conversation. So I'd like us to now talk a little bit about process and outcomes. and how in my case they have been both influenced by your philosophy. I know there may be some misreading, but I also know that you have always been open to interpretation and adaptation. So as I was saying, your concept of metaphor has been of fundamental importance for the formulation of my own notion of hypersection. In terms of design, such a precondition ended up in the formulation of a precise procedure design procedure that I want to briefly illustrate to you. Two two-dimensional patterns are extruded along their orthogonal direction. Their projections are then Boolean intersected so as to generate a new three-dimensional object. Following such process enables you to produce a complex three-dimensional structure that is simplified in its two-dimensional generators. Put it simply, it is a sort of rediscovery of descriptive geometry within the digital realm. Descriptive geometry was first systematized by Gaspar Monge in 1851. It is a precise design method that allows us to construct a complex three-dimensional object by the intersection of its two-dimensional projection. I find this method, which I reinterpret using digital tools, fascinating because it leaves the projectors unaltered while creating a new three-dimensional object. What is interesting to me, as you may guess, is the system of indirect relation comprising the two-dimensional patterns, the three-dimensional structure, and the designer that manages and interprets the intersection. So in my opinion, such a methodology wants to transfer analogically the structure of metaphor into a design procedure. This is so true that, as you noted by metaphor, this procedure is also unidirectional and asymmetric. In other words, the process cannot be reversed from a three-dimensional object to a two-dimensional object without altering the logic of the system. So to conclude, hypersection is, in my opinion, a redefinition of descriptive geometry within the digital realm. So I wanted to ask you if there are pre-digital architectural or design ideas that you find particularly relevant to object-oriented ontology.
Yes, it might just take me a minute to put my finger on one. But let me back up and address this question by talking about why architecture interests me so much. As I've mentioned, I'm interested in formalism, and that interest came out of the visual arts primarily, maybe even first out of literature. And formalism can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different fields. But one thing it has to mean on some level is that a thing is cut off from its relations and taken on its own terms. A thing is taken as somehow cut off from everything else on some level. And ultimately, Kant's philosophy is the source of this, even though he only talks about it in his ethics. Kant talks about how an action is not ethical if it's done for any ulterior motive, no matter how good. So if you're a good person because you're afraid of going to hell, or if you're a good person because you want to have a good reputation for being a nice person, that might be socially beneficial, but it's not strictly ethical. An action is not ethical unless it is done for its own sake. And he calls that formalism in ethics, because it's an ethics that doesn't have to do with any consequences. Ultimately, doesn't have to do with any particular content. It just has to do with the fact that an action is performed in such a way that it could become a universal law. It's done in accordance with duty. To such an extent that Kant even prefers people who do their duty coldly and unemotionally, as opposed to an enthusiastic and friendly person who acts out of duty, because that's somehow a distraction. They're doing it out of warmth rather than out of duty. All right, now Kant doesn't talk about the term formalism, as far as I recall, in his philosophy of arts, but he might as well have. It's the same idea. The idea that an artwork and the beholder, as Fried will call it, are cut off from each other. They're separate terms. An artwork cannot be paraphrased. An artwork is not beautiful because it's useful or because it has good social effects. It's simply beautiful in its own right, and this is judged by taste. And it's independent of us, although ultimately for Kant, art is about our side. It's about the fact that we all share the same faculty of judgment universally, and that's what art is really about. It's about us, not about the objects. But the formalism there is important to me because, again, holism is a philosophical danger. This idea that everything affects everything else, everything is affected by everything in its environment is just intellectually lazy. You have to figure out which parts of the environment a thing is affected by and which parts it's not affected by. All right. Okay, now, it's interesting. How does architecture fit into Kant's schema of the arts? Not very well. He ranks architecture very low because it's useful. He says that architecture, precisely because it has a purpose outside of itself, it is not a form of pure beauty. And so he ranks it fairly low. For Kant, literature is the highest form of art. Schopenhauer ranks architecture even lower. But now I found that I simply didn't agree with that. You can't simply look at great works of architecture and say, oh, these are useful, so therefore they don't rise to the level of pure beauty. Something like the Taj Mahal, which was one of my great travel experiences in my life. It's one of the most beautiful human-made artifacts you can imagine. Or on the design level, King Tut's sarcophagus, which I got to see in Egypt when I worked there many times, right across the street from my office. So Kant has to be wrong. There has to be a way of doing formalism with usefulness, formalizing usefulness. Now, what you don't do is you don't formalize usefulness by getting rid of it. And this is where I disagree with Eisenman in particular. Eisenman is too close, I think, to Kant and to this tradition in art criticism of Michael Fried, where you have to cut off the artwork from the human. Somehow you're contaminating it with theatricality if you bring the human too much into the artwork. And I wrote in Art and Objects that I don't agree with Fried about that, much as I respect him. Eisenman is sort of the architecture version of Fried, where he is, in many cases, trying to deliberately obstruct usefulness. So he puts a column down the middle of the room or down the middle of a bed. And he says, because it disrupts the usual metaphysics of dining. All right, but that's a theoretical stunt in a way that doesn't necessarily work. It's a way of turning the entire interior of the building into a facade. It stops being a useful medium. It becomes something to be contemplated. And so that's the wrong way to do it, to simply subvert the usefulness of a thing. That's Eisenman and maybe Derrida's own crusade against humanism that doesn't really interest me much. So what I've been trying to do when writing on architecture is think of ways in which you can take the function term of architecture, the usefulness of it, and still formalize it, which means de-relationize it, even though it's a relation. It's a relation without a relation. How do you do that? And I think one of the ways I found that this is being done is by Kohlhaas, at least in the way that Jeffrey Kipnis is describing, the way that he, gotten Kipnis's term, but it has to do with the way Kohlhaas is generalizing the function in such a way that it's not really any specific function anymore. It's not any specific program, like it is unbuilt Tate Modern design. Yeah, there's some functionality there, there's some programmaticism there, but it's not really for anything in particular. It doesn't really read as an art gallery. It reads as something vague. As Kant puts it, purposiveness without purpose. I think Kohlhaas is one example of how architecture can and is doing that. Purposiveness without purpose. So these are some of the ideas from architecture that interest me. And there are others. Even when I read Venturi, I sympathize as a philosopher with a lot of what Venturi is saying, or Aldo Rossi in Architecture of the City. I am sympathetic with that sort of early postmodernism because I'm not a rationalist. And philosophical rationalism makes a great parallel with high modernism in architecture. The idea that everything can be transparent, everything can be built according to a plan, everything can be univocal. And I think Venturi and Rossi are two of the authors who find tools to counteract that in ways that I find interesting for philosophy. For example, the way in Rossi that objects can absorb their history, the way that objects become monumental, that objects can help structure the space rather than being structured by space. This has been something very useful for me. And I love the classics. I love Venturi and Alberti. I think Vitruvius and Alberti. That sometimes Vitruvius gets a bad rap. I think there's a lot in there. It's a wonderfully elegantly constructed treatise. Ancient writing at its finest. So I always gain a lot from the classics in any fields. I know we're sort of at an anti-classicist moment now because of diversity concerns, which I get, especially in the United States. But classics are works that have stood the test of time, which means that they have outlived their political usefulness of their time, right? And so they have something that speaks to different eras, to different political orientations, to different civilizations. Let me give one final philosophical example. Alain Badiou, he has many fanatical devotees in contemporary philosophy. My big problem with Badiou and trying to figure out where he ranks on the list of great philosophers of all time, he's very good at least. One of the worries I have about him is that the people who are attracted to Badiou right now are the people who agree with his politics. So it's people who share his radical revolutionary politics who gravitate towards him because they agree with his Maoism, or they agree with his unapologetic revolutionary politics. Whereas what you find when you look at philosophy is that the really great people, Plato was anti-democratic and an aristocrat. He's of interest to leftists and rightists. Heidegger was a Nazi. He's of interest to leftists. Hegel was sort of center-right or maybe a little further right, and yet is of great interest to leftists. The really great philosophers are the ones who go deep enough that whatever your politics are, you get something out of the philosophers. And Badiou still has to prove that he can attract right-wing Badiouians before I'll be sure that he's one of the greats. Let's see what happens over the next 20 or 30 years. And I just mentioned that because I like reading the canon when it comes to architectural theory. I like reading the classic works. Gives me something to grab onto.
Yeah, totally. Actually, you have been, first of all, anticipating one question that is going to come afterwards. That's great, actually, because it means that we are in the same path. Secondly, I really wasn't expecting your reading of Renkulas, and I totally understand. And to me, it is really, really interesting reading, and one of the most actually, especially connected to philosophic thinking that I've heard in the last years. And also I was not expecting your comment on Eisman, because even if it doesn't say that, I always saw Eisman as a person and as in terms of work, a work that is that could be related to object-oriented ontology into many points. Especially, actually, the column that doesn't do what it's supposed to do is something that I found that relevant or linked to object-oriented ontology thinking. But as you say, actually, is too evident. It's not sophisticated as in a way. We could do actually as architect more than that. And your words about this idea of formalizing what is the functional, it is to me really, really interesting, and I have to think a little bit more about that. But it's really opening my ideas and my view of what I could do in the next few years as a research. So yeah, thank you very much for all these inputs. And so I want to now move for a moment from the design process to the final product, the building, the installation, or the dress. Your revolutionary reading of Heidegger concentrates on his tool analysis. An object becomes more apparent when it stops doing what it's supposed to do, from ready to hand to present at hand. I assume you may agree that this is also true when a tool is functioning counterintuitively. Therefore, from it doesn't do what it's supposed to do to it does what it's not supposed to do. Art often works this way. So I'd like to briefly show you a collaboration I did a few years ago with a friend, with the fashion tech designer Anouk Wieprecht. It's always great to work with her. It's the smoke dress. The smoke dress reacts when someone steps into the personal space of the wearer by emitting steam fluids. What may appear as a simple interaction project and therefore as a sort of soft mediation is not so straightforward. The smoke actually separates the model from the observer. The surprise and unexpected reaction of the dress ends up highlighting the space of separation between the two. At the same time, the fluids become a sort of autonomous new element that starts fluctuating independently and in an uncontrolled way. You cannot truly control the smoke. So in my interpretation, this is a project that exists in the threshold between the inside and the outside. It is a threshold that becomes evident precisely because it does something that is unexpected and acquires independence. So independence to me is another term that is interesting and crucial perhaps. So I was wondering if a broken tool in a way may be read as a form of independence.
Yes, it can. For me, that is the point, and it's against Heidegger's own intention, because of course, Heidegger thinks what his tool analysis means is that interdependence is more important than independence, right? And so the tool analysis is supposed to show that everything is linked together primarily, and that if we see things as separate substances sitting in space, that's derivative. That's somehow a second-hand thing. What's primary is this interconnectivity of tools. Whereas what I say in response to that is that forgets the fact that tools can break. That's one of the most fundamental themes of Heidegger, along with the usefulness of tools, is the fact that they can break. And they couldn't break unless there was some surplus in the tools that were not inscribed in the current functioning. So I counter that Heidegger's wrong about his own analysis, that actually independence is prior to dependence. A hammer has to exist with its own properties before it can be used in the context of tools. And so, yes, for me, aesthetics and ontology are both about autonomy and independence, about a thing separating itself from relations. Not that it can't relate, but that relations take a great deal of work, and that not all relations are successful. So, yes, I think the independence of the tool is the key to how I read it, which goes opposite, runs counter to how pretty much every other commentator reads Heidegger as a philosopher of interconnectivity of tools. For me, it's about the disconnection of tools.
Thank you. So in Art plus Objects, or Art and Objects, you talk extensively about metaphor by associating it to the experience of art. By simplifying, and in my interpretation, we may say that since real objects are never accessible, a way to indirectly approach reality is to generate it via experience. So art, in this sense, is crucial. In art, the observer performs the quality of the art piece, and this transposition of qualities from the art piece to the observer works exactly as a metaphor. It implies the creation of a new real object that is the symbiosis of the observer plus the qualities of the art piece. The observer does not access any of the real qualities of the art piece, but it generates a new real object via its experience and interpretation. In this context, acting becomes of a particular interest. And you write about, specifically while talking about the Stanislavski method, an actor playing a role is perhaps, in my view, a sort of perfect synthesis of a metaphor. It is not by chance that you use the term theatrical. I found this insight to be fundamental to understand art and its subjectivity, but also it strongly relates to my interest in coexistence, intersection, and ultimately aberration. So once again, the contemporaneous existence of two entities that, by remaining distinct, offer the precondition for something other to emerge. On this matter, I have two questions that relate to the success of music and cinema over other forms of art. Both are compelling, I guess. Music is effective because of its capacity to be easily absorbed, perhaps. In the case of cinema, I assume it is due to the presence of a sort of double metaphor. that of the observer playing the actor, playing the role, which is a sort of multi-layered experience, but those were just my first reading. So I wanted to ask about your opinion about theatricality and especially in the cinema and music, yes.
Yeah, I think you're right that in music, theatricality is the most inescapable because you can't really close yourself off to music when you're in it. Bad music bothers us more than bad art does because you just don't have to look at the art. If you're walking down the street and can't stand the music somebody's playing, it's overpowering. Right? You have to get away because there's no way to close off music in the way that there is for other art. So there is a kind of basic theatricality to music. I simply haven't written about music much yet. I've written one essay on classical music that hasn't been published yet. Cinema I haven't really written about either. One essay, mostly because cinema is not one of the arts I know best. And so you start with what you know best. Literature and painting in my case, I guess. Yes, theatricality is necessary for any art form for me because, as I argue in Art and Objects, you have to become absorbed in the artwork in much the same way that the figures in the art are themselves absorbed, right? Fried uses the term absorption as a way of getting the beholder away, right? That the figures in the painting are absorbed in what they're doing and they're not paying any attention to us. And theatricality means they're putting on a show for us, and he doesn't like that. He thinks that's the death of arts. Even when he talks about bad contemporary art, in his opinion, he calls it theatrical. But then this funny thing happens to Fried, which is that as he gets further forward in art history and gets up to Courbet and Manet, he realizes there is a theatrical element to the painting. In Manet's case, usually a central figure is staring right at us. And even if that weren't the case, the whole canvas is kind of confronting us directly rather than receding into three-dimensional depth. It's all there on the surface. It's flat, as Greenberg said, but for different reasons. And so I think Fried even has to admit in the end that there's a theatrical element to arts, whereas I just take that and make it central. So much so that I think that theater was probably the first art. I mean, the oldest art we have, of course, are the cave paintings in Lassault and Chauvet, even older. But I suspect that masks were the oldest art form. There's something primal about a mask. Why is it so frightening to see the Ku Klux Klan wearing masks? You know that these are just average, ignorant rednecks behind the masks. Stupid racists whose opinions you wouldn't take seriously. But the fact that they have masks makes them very frightening. Children, if they put on a Batman mask, they feel as if they've been transformed into something different, into a superhero. And I think I tell this story in one of my books, but I'll tell it here again. One of the most remarkable experiences I've had is that when I was in Chicago, there was a Halloween party I was invited to, costume party, and I waited till the last minute. I waited until the morning of Halloween, and the only good disguise left in the Halloween costume store was a zebra mask from Tanzania, and it was a pretty scary zebra mask. It had kind of smoky rings around the eyes. It looked like a zebra that had risen from the dead or something, and I got the prize for the costume. But more importantly, I left it at my parents' house. They locked it up in a cabinet, and one day I put on that mask, and my parents' two dogs went crazy with anger. I mean, they love me, and they've known me for years. They know my smell. But this dog couldn't start barking angrily in horrified fashion at me in the zebra mask, as though I had become a different entity. And the other dog actually came up for the side and jumped and knocked the mask off my face. And this just shows you that children and animals, who are maybe the most sincere in their reactions of any entities we know, find masks extremely powerful. There's something at the root, some horror at the root of being about masks. So I suspect this was the first art form, that you're performing something that you're not. You're taking on the qualities of another thing. And this summons up a lot of emotion in all those who are watching, including animals. So I think if I were going to write a speculation on the history of aesthetics, I think the mask would be my starting point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually working with fashion and couture, okay, it is not a mask, but it is about, again, a boundary and a threshold that is around the body. You start thinking on the importance and the effect of this element that is actually transforming your body. And to me, it is really interesting in this context also the moment of overlap. If you think about, you know, all the movies, the Marvel movies and so on, where actually you have at the same time the mask that is broken and you see the people, the person wearing the mask. And I think this is the moment where you are both or simultaneously capable of seeing the mask that is the representation, the limit, the threshold, and what is, let's say, inside, that is the person wearing them, wearing the mask. I think that there is a sort of intensity in those moments that is particularly interesting. And going back to your think about the mask of this zebra, yeah, I mean, I have a cat that that really loves me, but every time I wear a pullover, there is one pullover that it doesn't like at all, and every time I'm wearing it, I don't know why I start getting crazy. So I think there is a really powerful. I don't know how would I say, but character and potentiality in the thresholds, in something that is between us and what we have around. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, in terms of thresholds, I'd like to move now from the experience of art to the experience of space. In terms of hypersection in architecture, the threshold as the intersection becomes a crucial space. Think about the famous central scene in the movie Lost in Translation by Sofia Coppola, in which the female protagonist, Charlotte, played by Scarlett Johansson, sits on the sill of the window at the Park Hyatt Hotel. On that sill, she can hover above the city of Tokyo whilst remaining inside her room. The image draws attention to the way in which Charlotte is both inside and outside, living two very different kinds of space simultaneously without fully occupying either. It is an analogy for other kinds of overlap in the film. Charlotte moves between languages, Japanese and English, to relationship, the marriage and the friendship, two moments of life, her youth and the maturity of her friends, played by Bill Murray. Moreover, she lives in a hotel that is a kind of home without inhabiting Tokyo, so without being a resident in Tokyo. So I just wanted to show you briefly a video. I don't know if it's gonna have the audio or not, but doesn't really matter. So her position on the sill highlights a mediation between all these oppositional zones. She lives in a space that I would call hypersection. Charlotte little by little explores that physical but also mental space. In the movie there is a window, but there are many other architectural spaces that are expanded thresholds, such as porticos in the ancient cities. My idea of architecture attempts to explore these spaces of architectural coexistence, where the inside and the outside exist simultaneously, and where people can experience duality in both corporal and psychological ways. So to conclude, I would like to ask you, but perhaps it's a too complex question, but wherein lies the limits of an object?
Interesting. I was just reviewing an article that asked this same question about object-oriented ontology. What do we have to say about limit? I tend to have a fairly strict idea of limit, that a thing is either inside the object or it's not. Because for me, when it's inside the object, it's sensual. When it's outside the object, it's real but inaccessible. Leibniz, who is a philosopher of substance in Aristotle's tradition, adds one huge innovation to Aristotle's tradition, which he's the first that I can think of to say substance has an inside. Right? Each of us is on the inside of a monad, looking at all these things that are happening because God has put them there by pre-established harmony. We're not actually touching anything else. God is making it seem like we're touching other things. So for me, you're either inside or outside. What I would say about the thresholds in the case of Sofia Coppola's film is that there's a separate third term there. I wouldn't say that it's both inside and outside. I'd say that that section is actually a third and different place. I think the clearest ultimate way to distinguish between the inside of an object and the outside is that as soon as you're looking at something, you're no longer inside it. You can be inside an object and looking at it at the same time, but then those are two different things. So for example, let's say I start thinking about myself, or looking at myself in the mirror, or looking at myself on the Zoom camera, as I'm doing right now. Modern thought tends to privilege this moment of self-reflexivity, that looking into the mirror is somehow ontologically special, or when a statement can't make true statements about itself, like I am lying, the Cretan liar's paradox. These are taken as somehow privileged moments for thoughts, self-reflexive moments. Whereas for me, self-reflexivity is not as interesting as people think it is. Right? As soon as I look at myself, it's just like me looking at you. Yes, I happen to be myself. I don't happen to be you, but the I that I am seeing here on the Zoom camera is not the I that is speaking. There's a difference. They're two different objects. Philosophy of mind often gets occupied with this debate between first person and third person descriptions. So that the real hardcore scientific people say that everything can be explained from a third person scientific standpoint. The fact that you are having first person experience isn't important. It can be explained in third person terms. Of course, I don't agree with that, but more importantly, perhaps, I think that both first person and third person experience are distortions of what's really there. My introspection is no more accurate than my description of you, ultimately. Yes, I know more about myself than I know about you in factual terms. I'm familiar with myself, but there might be things about me that you know better than I know, right? It's often the case that we learn better about ourselves by getting feedback from others. If we are just stuck with introspection, we make all kinds of mistakes about ourselves. You might think that someone might think that they're not very social and not good at parties, and others will tell them they're the life of the party, that they're fun to be around. We misjudge ourselves easily, right? Because we're too invested in knowing ourselves. We often get a better understanding of ourselves through others. So I don't think either first person or third person is the key. What's key is the fact that I have a certain reality that I don't understand and that you don't understand, and the same for you, and the same for anything else. So getting back to your question about the limits, I think the limit it's a pretty stark one, that you're either inside an object or being that object, seeing it in sensual terms, or else there's an object outside you, a real object that you can't quite get at.
Yeah, I totally agree, and especially agree with your first affirmation when you say that actually a treasure is an object by itself at a certain point, and I think that's why I don't use the term intersection, but I use the term hypersection, exactly because I believe, as you do, that in the moment you actually intersect two items, in this case, the inside of a building and the outside of the building, but as I've been sure it could be communication, personalities, and so on, what is in between gets its own autonomy and becomes in some way independent. That's why I use the term hypersection, which is again a different one, because as you were saying, I think that there is a sort of autonomy, and the treasure is an object by itself. It is dependent on the generator, but at the same time, it's something that is completely its own object. So
actually, I wasn't even thinking of the architectural side of the question. I should have. Just struck rereading Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, how much emphasis he lays on the fact that the inside and outside of a building can be in tension, whereas for modernism, there was supposed to be, you're supposed to flow from the plan outward. And more recently, the idea that the building itself blends into the environment. I like the idea that the inside can be treated in a radically different fashion from the outside. It fits with what I think philosophically.
So I think that we are now on the final section, so section 3, and I'd like to conclude by talking a little bit about the tragic events of 2020. This was supposed to be the year of the Hashim Sarkis Biennale. Its title, How We Will Live Together, unexpectedly took a dramatic connotation because of the climate, health, and social events that unfolded. So when you write about architecture, you always stress the importance of functionality in terms of sustainability, fruition, economy, but at the same time, you also highlight how architecture can be justified for its solely technical aspects, and that it should have values beyond the technical ones. The idea of architecture being something other than functional suddenly became evident in 2020 because of the critical situation due to the coronavirus. Cities abruptly became empty, humanless, and all spaces that had being designed for motion and togetherness had to be transformed into borders, into non-relational architectures. Architecture deprived or reversed in its function became much more apparent. Let's just think of all the videos that were shot during the lockdown. Here is an evocative image of the Pope talking in front of an empty square of San Pietro in Rome. So putting aside for a moment the social, economical, and medical gravity of the situation, we actually understand that object-oriented ontology, what object-oriented ontology is asking architects to do, to also consider architecture for what it is in aesthetic terms, so beyond its native function. So do you agree? You have been answering a little bit this question before talking about ranculas and also talking about that architects have this tendency on justifying their students, especially their project, by talking about the process that actually created the object.
What's interesting is that there are two different critiques of object-oriented ontology in architecture, and they're opposite critiques, and they often come from the same people. The first critique is object-oriented ontology can't tell architects what to do, and architects who follow philosophers always just make bad literal notations, like putting folds on buildings after they read Deleuze or something like that. That's the first critique. The second critique, which is the opposite, is that object-oriented ontology is not yet a design philosophy. It just tells us that objects withdraw. And sometimes people make those two opposite critiques in the same article. On the one hand, they say we shouldn't be talking to architecture. On the other hand, they say they fail. We talk to architects enough and tell them what to do. Well, of course, I can't tell an architect how to design. I see myself as a learner. I try to feel stimulated by what architects do, and if they're stimulated by my ideas, that's great, of course, too. But it's going to be indirect. You can't literally adapt an idea from another discipline. You have to transform it. You have to translate it into something that makes sense in the new field. There are problems that architects have to deal with that philosophers don't, and that was the gist of Eisenman's response to Derrida. I take Eisenman's side in that exchange. Derrida's being very fussy about what exactly cora means or what absence means, and Eisenman says, look, I have to build something that doesn't fall down. So there's a limit to what kind of critique of presence Eisenman can make, because he has to make something that's present and durable enough to not fall. And Derrida doesn't have to. He can critique everything inside if he wants. So there are always differences between genres. What I regret is that sometimes one sees a defensive reaction that either architects either saying philosophers have nothing to teach us, or in some cases claiming the reverse, that actually philosophers are learning from architects and exaggerating in that sense. What I'm thinking of here is the 1988 Deconstructivist catalog. We know Mark Wigley knows Derrida's work very well. He wrote his PhD on him. He wrote a book on him. And yet I went back and reread that catalog essay of Wigley's recently, and it's remarkable. He never mentions Derrida once by name. He mentions deconstruction a couple of times without mentioning Derrida by name, but the whole catalog essay makes it seem like, oh, this is all just in reaction to Russian constructivism. It has nothing to do with deconstruction in philosophy, which I don't know if he was pressured to write like that by Philip Johnson or someone else, but it contradicts what happens in his book where he talks about what a great influence Derrida is. But architecture is influenced by all fields. Right? Architecture is in dialogue with all fields. It's not especially autonomous in the classical sense, meaning that architects are always looking for new ideas from everywhere, more than, say, philosophers are. And I think that's a strength of architects. You have to know about banking and politics and engineering, and so why should philosophy be excluded? It's not that all these fields are telling architects what to do and architects are just applying the other fields. It's just that architecture is an especially hybrid discipline. It's a sectional discipline, as you might put it. It's bringing together all these ideas from different places and trying to build a new whole out of them, and always working with constraints, which is what I most admire about architects. You have to work with constraints, which means there's a certain realist principle in what you're doing. There's something you have to get done, or you're going to lose the competition. When I wrote The Quadruple Object, I have an introduction to that book that talks about how I was working under constraints, right? That I had a certain maximum grant amount I was able to get to fund the translation, and there's a certain translator's salary scale in France that you have to observe, and so the length of the book was determined by the size of the grant I could get. Once I knew the maximum length of the book, then I could start working with what the book's going to be about. And I thought of that as working like an architect, right? Working with a budget, which is something that philosophers don't often have to do. And I took that as a liberating series of constraints. Once certain things are decided for you, it's easier to make the other decisions. Barack Obama talks about this somewhere. He says that, why do you always see me wearing a brown or blue suit on most days? He said, it's because I have so many important decisions to make every day. I can't afford to waste time deciding on my clothes or deciding what I'm going to have for lunch. I always have the same thing for lunch every day because you need to limit your number of decisions about unimportant things. Well, knowing exactly how long that book could be meant, and knowing how long I had to write it, I knew the deadline from the press. There were all these constraints I had to work on, to work with. And I think architects are lucky to have those constraints. Maybe they can break them once in a while creatively, but it's good to have them.
Yeah, this is so true that, that we actually create those constraints. And very often it's, if you are doing like some research project or some kind of more, let's say, free project or speculative project, we build constraints. Those constraints may be parameters, maybe geometric rules, or maybe intellectual one, exactly by being inspired by philosophical reading or perhaps by inspiration from other fields and so on. So we build, actually, we have to probably, we would have a hard time in working without boundaries and constraints.
Yeah. It's interesting that the golden era of philosophy's dialogue with architecture has been since the 1970s. I mean, you can find some earlier. You can find Louis Sullivan being influenced by Transcendentalism and Emerson. And there's always a bit of Plato out there and a little Kant out there. But the golden age has been since the 1970s with Heidegger. So it's interesting, this golden age of philosophy and architecture has happened during the reaction to high modernism in architecture, as though architecture is still trying to find itself after the modernist episode and trying to find principles. And so it's been especially open to influences from the outside, with philosophy being just one of them. And I don't think it's over yet. I think we'll see what architects end up doing with O. I think it's still early just to know for sure, but I don't think O is going to disappear for architects. If only because you're going to see me writing a lot more about architecture, ways that I think people might find interesting. It's just taking me a while to become professionally competent enough to have anything to say about it. It's a steep learning curve in architecture. You guys have your own set of references that we don't know much about when we're not from inside the discipline. I still don't really know how to learn to read plans. I was just asking David Rue the other day, what do I read to learn how to understand plans? And he gave me a couple of suggestions, because you guys all do this in school. It's not something that a layperson can easily master or even get a first acquaintance with. It's such a special technical discipline.
Yeah, it is true. I just was thinking while you were talking that actually in my experience, triple O has been fundamental not only for architecture but for thinking in general. For me, triple O is important because it helped me in making my own idea, understanding, and view of the world in general and of reality in general. And then I try to translate these in architectural forms as we all do as architects. But the relation between object-oriented ontology and architecture is important, but to me it is more important as the relation between, which is the native probably relation between triple O and reality and the world and the understanding of the world, because this is actually helping me in understanding art, since we have been writing about this, but also about starting asking questions about cinema, about music, about about the experience. When I experience something that is more in a deeper way, I start understanding why perhaps this experience has been so important for me, because there is. And I try to, now the discourse is a little bit too long, but it's I just wanted to say that the philosophy and object-oriented ontology, and actually your writings have been important for architecture, but also for my life in general, for the understanding of reality.
Well, thank you, Niccolo.
And so to conclude, after many years of correlationism, of correlationist thinking in general, object-oriented ontology, together with speculative realism, liberated ontology from the supremacy of human beings. Object-oriented ontology is a flat ontology that is non-anthropocentric and that insists on democracy. All elements are equal. Whether it is a tree, a stone, a house, a bird, a human being. Such a standpoint is strongly relevant to contemporary issues that concern equality. On the one hand, ecology, on the other, equal rights. So I wanted to ask as my last question to discuss a little bit more this in detail.
All right, and this is an interesting moment to do it. Given what's happening in the United States, especially since the murder of George Floyd. One thing that should be said is we are sometimes criticized for the flat ontology because people are saying that triple O claims humans are the equal of garbage because humans are an object and garbage is an object. Well, of course not, because flat ontology is about ontology. It's not about politics. Flat ontology is only a first step, by the way, too. It's simply a way of getting us to press the reset button and not assume that we know for sure that humans are one thing and everything else in the universe is another, which is the modern taxonomy. The idea that humans are something so special and so different in kind from everything else that we make up 50% of ontology. And this leads to a division of labor where science gets to do all the talking about inanimate objects and philosophy and the humanities just talk about people and people-related stuff, which I think has been paralyzing for philosophy. Now, of course, something else that happens is that we're in an age where democracy has the upper hand in most political discussions. Democracy always sounds good, especially if you insist on radical democracy, where we're going to empower people who have been excluded. Of course, that sounds great, and of course we should do more of that. The problem is, as soon as no one is looking, we all become snobbish hierarchy supporters, and not just political, right? We choose our friends carefully. We choose our lovers carefully. We choose there's some music we like better than others. There's some food we will eat and other food we don't eat. Life is about setting up hierarchies. I hope anyone's given hierarchy doesn't include racism and sexism as two of its pillars, but there's always going to be some sort of hierarchy. We're always going to be choosing one system as better than another. And one of the philosopher's jobs is to challenge the various idols that Francis Bacon talks about. He talks about the idols of the tribe, the idols of the theater, the idols of the cave. And so philosophers have to be able to say unpopular things too. I got in trouble on Twitter a couple of weeks ago because in this anti-police moment, which is very understandable in the United States, I suggested that we're probably not going to be able to get along without some sort of law enforcement. And the reaction was more violent against me than any time in the history of my Twitter accounts, because we have a very strong abolition movement, abolishing the police. And I agree that a lot of current police work should be given to social workers or psychiatrists and things of that sort. But you're still going to have serial killers and rapists and terrorists and things like this, and you're going to need some sort of force. And so what I worry about is that an idealistic assumption that society will ever be able to do without violence. I'm skeptical of that. I mean, modern political theory was really a debate between two conceptions of human nature, right? You have the Hobbes and Machiavelli version, where humans are naturally ferocious beasts who need to be tamed and prevented from slaughtering each other. And then you have the optimistic vision of Rousseau, who claims that society corrupted us and that we're actually nice and kind, and if we just get rid of societal inequality, things will be fine. Well, we may want to tilt more in one direction than the other, but Rousseauism is just as incorrect as the other side. I don't trust my fellow humans to not use violence and steal. And so I think we do need some sort of protection from the violence of other humans. And this is going to involve some kind of hierarchy. This is going to involve a government. And so the question for me is simply how much of this violence can we get rid of? I think we can get rid of a lot of it. Right? I think the defense budget, military budget of the United States is far too high. It needs to be scaled back, and the money needs to be spent on better things. So that there are war machines, and there are times in which weapons create their own violence. But what I'm trying to get at here, indirectly in response to your question, is that flat ontology does not necessarily lead directly to egalitarian democracy where everything is based on self-organizing communes or syndicates. That's a separate question. The ontological flatness is simply trying to say, be careful, stop for a second, and make sure you're giving every kind of entity its due. Don't be so sure that you know the difference between humans and animals, or between animals and plants. We have all kinds of inherited categories about what the difference is between humans, animals, and plants, and viruses. It's interesting, the virus, because it's right on the border between living and non-living. A virus is like a seed that does nothing but reproduce other seeds. It never grows into a full-blown organism, but just remains a seed that multiplies other seeds by the millions and makes us sick in the process. This is an interesting time to ask about the virus. And yes, it's also an interesting time to question the existing human hierarchies, especially at a time when we have a president in the United States who is a full-blown idiot and a racist who enjoys sending covert and overt signals to other racists. More needs to be done about the position of African Americans and women in this country. I just want people to be careful about not assuming that all the problems come from the top, that not all the problems come from the society. There are also some problematic aspects of human beings that we need to make allowances for in our society.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to conclude briefly, I'm super happy to have had the chance to work with three amazing women and artists and people. There are Iris van Herpen and Anouk Wigbrecht and Beth Cartier that have deeply influenced my work, and it has been a super great honor and pleasure to work with them. So I think we finished in terms of question. If we have a little bit more time, I may ask you two things that came into my mind
Sure.
while we were talking.
Are you stopping the tape?
I'm stopping the sharing the screen at least.
Okay. We're still in recording, yeah.
Yeah, I'm still recording it, hopefully.
It says recording.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And so let me. So the first question was yeah, about Florence, because we were talking about in our email exchange during this day. So you know, I'm from Florence. Florence is my hometown, and you know that geometry is an important matter in my research. Florence was the birthplace of the Renaissance and the place in which perspective was invented. So I think it is a time for a rediscovery of Renaissance. You know that Baroque have been super famous for between architects in this recent time, and I think that I'm gonna spend the summer probably also reading, studying Palladio, Brunelleschi, Alberti, but at the same time also Peter Eisman, and his work, you know, strongly relates to that architectural moment. So I don't want to ask you about the relation between geometry and philosophy because it's a really too long question. But you told me that you have a special interest in the Medici period. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, of course, my first interest in Florence is Dante. I really fell in love with Dante on my first reading as an undergraduate. And then, of course, I went on to write a book about Dante, Dante's Broken Hammer. And he's always there in my thoughts. For me, Dante is the perfect antidote to Kant, because Kant is about the autonomy and the sense of separation, whereas for Dante, everything's about attachments. Right? The people are judged by their loves, by their attachments to various good and bad things. So I think Dante has a lot of resources that philosophy can use. So that was my first interest in Florence. And then if you go forward a century, yes, the whole period of the Medici, Brunelleschi's Dome and all the painters. I'm interested in Machiavelli as well. It's like taking a good cold shower to read Machiavelli. Clear-headed thinker. And then when I was reading Aldo Rossi, I began thinking about the city of Florence itself as a monument. The fact that so many different things have happened there, and you can never be sure, maybe something will happen there again. Always possible. And I'm not sure exactly what happened in Florence during Roman times. Perhaps important things happened then too. I just don't know that period as well for Florence. And I suppose you learned all this in school. I suppose there was a lot of civic pride in this. Yes, it interests me always the way a certain city can keep drawing important things that happen there over and over again over the course of multiple centuries. And we have other examples, right? So, you know, Leipzig is another example. Another city I know better than Florence. Certain places draw events and are inscribed with the events that occurred there. The United States is still young, and so we're still building that map of landmarks, and it's a slow process. And I think the country is going to be very different once that has happened. Once there's something historical that happened in every little place, which you already have in Europe and especially in Italy. I remember once reading a book by Giordano Bruno, and he's talking about how he was from Nola, near Naples, and the person writing the introduction said, Nola was the birthplace of Giordano Bruno, and it's also the place where Augustus Caesar died. So then he sarcastically said, clearly it has a very undistinguished history. And you have these small places in Italy that are like that. I recently signed a translation deal for a book being translated into Italian, and the place of the publisher is Pompeii, which made me laugh. You know, here's this incredible historical place, and I'm having a book published there. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there are certain places where events happen that make the city itself somehow more monumental. Maybe not just one building, but make the whole city a monument. That make you feel in awe just to be there. Paris being an obvious example. You know, what neighborhood doesn't have 5 or 10 plaques of famous writers who have lived there? But the interesting thing for me with Florence is that I've been there, but it's been literally 30 years. I was there my first semester of graduate school at the end. I was there around Christmas time, 1990. And for me, I found that 7 years is about the time my memory of a place lasts. If I'm there more than 7 years later, I'm really confused about how the city fits together, I found. And so if I went back to Florence now, all I have are a few visual images. And I know a lot more about Florence's history now than I knew in 1990. So it will be a much more meaningful trip for me than it was then.
So yeah, it's time to come back and yeah, of course, also to rediscover Renaissance and to rediscover a little bit. You know, I think when you were talking before about the future evolution of the relation and the mutual influence between object-oriented ontology and architecture, one of the things that came into mind is also that I don't know if it's gonna happen, but in my case, I don't know exactly why, but object-oriented ontology helped me in rediscovering some of the master of architecture. So perhaps it is because architecture have been influenced by the environmental issues and the correlationist thinking for so long that at a certain point, through object-oriented ontology, you start, acquiring a new and old interest for what architecture is by itself in its aesthetic, and this is what happened to me, probably, and maybe something that's going to happen also to other architects, to rediscover architecture and your own masters, that in my case are the Alberti, Brunelleschi, and Palladio, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's always been a classicist spirit at O, because that's the kind of education I had, and thinking contemporary is important, but we're part of a long human history. It's something easier for Italians to recognize because you're surrounded by it. The United States, we were born in modernity and we're about making new stuff all the time. We're not as attached to or even as knowledgeable of our history as you are in Italy. And yes, I'm always turning to Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Leibniz and these classical figures for inspiration more than I am living authors sometimes, because a lot of good work has already been done.
So yeah, and so also congratulations for your the Italian book. I don't want to ask you which one, but I'm super curious.
A brand new one. It's a collection of essays, a collection of articles that have never been assembled together in English. It's going to be called The Only Exit from Modern Philosophy, the title of one of the articles. And I don't know, I chose 12 or 13, 14 articles to be translated. It's coming out at December.
I'm super happy, and it's going to be your first book in Italian, right?
They're working on the quadruple object, have been for the last 3 years, but I don't know what happened with it. It's just not done yet.
Okay, and so yeah, of course, if you come to Italy, it's gonna be super nice to meet you, and also perhaps to organize something in Florence or in Ravenna, since we were talking in Ravenna, or in Rome. Yes. And my last question, then I leave you for today. For today, is about your teaching experience in a school of architecture. As you were saying before, students try to tend to, and as an architect, I tend to do the same. I don't know if it's justified, but it's to create a narrative of their project that is linked to the process that they use. It could be a design process or whatever, but to the process that they use to create the final outcome in terms of architecture or installation or whatever. I was wondering if you're trying to teach them or to find a way for them to talk about the aesthetic qualities of their building, or the quality of their building beyond, the process that actually generates the building.
Yeah, I teach aesthetic theory every spring semester, and so we get a bit of that every time. I've been using Mark Foster Gage's ontology, which is a series of aesthetic readings from history for design and architecture students. And there are a couple of architects in there. There's Alberti and Vitruvius, and there's also a little bit of Geoffrey Scott and some other architectural theory. I also taught a whole semester a few years ago of OOO in architecture, only later did I realize I wasn't supposed to do that, because all of my classes are supposed to be non-architectural content, because they already get enough architecture. And so to satisfy the core, there's supposed to be specifically non-architectural classes that I teach. So I actually broke a rule without knowing it. But architecture comes up a lot, of course. When I taught Heidegger last fall, I'd talk about Norberg Schultz and Peter Zumthor and Juni Pallasmaa and other figures who have kind of framed and other figures who have dealt with Heidegger in relation to architecture. And I also did a course called Architects and Their Philosophers, which was where I looked at things like Deleuze, Heidegger, Derrida, and how they might be of interest to architects. And of course, I'm always asking students architecture questions and constantly asking my colleagues. And almost every Wednesday night, there's a lecture by some visiting person. And as I mentioned, the SCI-Arc library, which is fairly thin in philosophy, but it's got all the stuff I need in architecture, enough for years of learning. So, and then almost any time I ask a question, I want to ask a question, I see somebody in the hall and I can ask them. So.
Thank you very much for your time. I think we are okay for today, and I'm gonna stop recording now, and then we can keep our conversation, continue our conversation. So again, Graham, Harman, thank you very much for your time. It has been a great pleasure and an honor personally for me. And so I'm really, really delighted for the occasion of talking with you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful for me too. Thank you, Niccolo.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful for me too. Thank you, Niccolo.